Tonight, we're not starting with a crowned head or a wise old thinker. We're diving into something wilder, riskier, and much messier. The hunt for love in medieval times. And let's be honest, trying to win someone's heart back then, surrounded by plagues, property deals, and ever-present chaperones, made your most awkward late-night DMs look like child's play. Forget romance as we know it. In this world, love wasn't serenades under the moon. It was paperwork, bargaining, and the fine print of who owned what field. Whether it was sending a noble lady a love song or haggling over goats for a marriage contract, the rules were written in land and livestock, not longing. Before you settle in, go ahead and hit like or subscribe, but only if this kind of deep dive history actually speaks to you. Drop your location and the time you're tuning in, too. I'm always amazed at how far these stories travel. Settle the room, maybe dim the lights, turn on some white noise, and get comfortable. We're stepping back into a world where love was a negotiation, not a feeling. Picture yourself standing in a muddy village square, or shivering in the halls of some old stone fortress, and wondering, how would you even begin? You won't charm anyone with small talk, and you definitely won't make your move over ale at the local tavern. The truth? Here, flirting is forbidden fruit. Courtship, as we know it, is a modern luxury. In this era, your future match is already being chosen for you, by your family, your overlord, maybe even your priest. And the bride price? That's not a bouquet of flowers. That's a herd of cattle, a patch of land, or whatever your kin can put on the table. They say war is chaos. Loud, bloody, brutal. But if you lived in the Middle Ages, love was far more dangerous. Because war at least had rules. You knew who your enemy was. You had armor, a sword, a banner to fight under. But love? That was a battlefield without a map. No one warned you where the traps were until it was too late. Back then, falling for someone wasn't something you could just do. You didn't meet a girl at the well, trade smiles, and walk off into the sunset. No, every glance, every whisper, every heartbeat out of place had weight. Real weight. The kind that could break alliances, start rumors, or bring shame on your whole bloodline. See, love didn't belong to you. It belonged to the people who raised you, to the priest who watched you from the pulpit, to the land your family swore loyalty to. A marriage wasn't about chemistry or connection. It was about cattle, land, and names carved into church books. So if your heart decided it wanted something or someone not already promised by parchment or politics, you had a problem. A quiet, burning, sleepless kind of problem. You'd have to hide your feelings in glances across crowded markets. Fold them into poems you'd never dare sign. Maybe you'd press a ribbon into their hand and pretend it meant nothing. Because love in that world wasn't a choice. It was a risk. A dangerous, thrilling, sometimes devastating risk. One wrong step and you weren't the hero of a romance. You were the fool in a scandal. And yet, people still fell. Hard. Often. Because even in an age ruled by warlords and bishops, the heart stayed wild. And nothing was more rebellious than wanting someone you weren't supposed to want. Romance, the kind we daydream about now. Slow dancing under the stars, love letters slipped under doors, whispered promises in the dark. Didn't really exist for most people back then. Not the way we picture it. Because in medieval life, love didn't happen in private. It wasn't two people figuring things out on their own. It was a public matter. A group project you didn't volunteer for, with your family, your church, and half the village watching your every move. You weren't just dating a person, you were dating their last name, their dowry, their status in the feudal ladder. And if you were thinking of straying outside that narrow path, there were consequences waiting in every shadow. The church had a say in who you could marry. And if the match didn't align with doctrine, or if you showed a little too much affection before it was blessed, you could be labeled immoral. Or worse, damned. There were rules about when, how, and even why you could love. Lust, sin, desire, dangerous, holding hands unsupervised. That might get you a sermon or exile or both. But it wasn't just religion. Social class built even higher walls. A baker's daughter couldn't hope to marry a noble's son. A knight might adore a shepherd's niece, but duty said he'd marry a baron's sister. Someone with land, with horses, with a family crest. Your heart wasn't yours. It belonged to the system. So when we picture medieval love as something poetic or romantic, we're not seeing the full picture. It wasn't poetry. It was politics. And every flirtation was a risk wrapped in ritual. In that world, even looking at the wrong person for too long could mean your life was no longer your own. Imagine this: you're 15, maybe 16, standing in the corner of a feast hall. Candles flicker. Someone plays a lute. And across the room, someone smiles at you. Not too much, just enough to make your chest tighten. You want to say something. Anything. But before the words can form, you feel it, the weight of eyes on you. Not just one set, dozens. There's the housemaid pretending to sweep, but really she's watching. Your aunt, seated by the fire, staring so hard it burns. The priest, silent in the corner, murmuring something about virtue under his breath. And then there's the chaperone, always near, always present. Her role wasn't subtle. She was a wall in human form. Back then, being alone with someone of the opposite sex wasn't just discouraged, it was forbidden. Even a conversation had to be overseen, timed, judged. A walk around the garden? Only if an elder trailed behind you. A moment by the well? Only if a sibling came too. The idea of being alone with someone you loved was, frankly, absurd. Because love was something to be controlled, measured, regulated. Chaperones weren't just nosy relatives. They were enforcers of morality. They made sure your innocence stayed marketable, your reputation untouched. Because a girl's value wasn't in who she loved, it was in how untouched she remained. And a boy? His reputation was tied to who he dared approach and how carefully he did it. Even accidental contact, a brushed sleeve, a shared laugh could spark talk. And talk? That could destroy lives. A whisper in the wrong ear, and suddenly you're no longer seen as eligible, you're seen as reckless, dishonorable, tainted. So people learned to love with limits, to feel everything, and show nothing. It wasn't just hard. It was exhausting. Back then, if your heart started leaning toward someone it shouldn't, you didn't write it down in a journal or post about it in a moment of courage. You learned how to keep it quiet, tucked behind your ribs like contraband. Because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't something you announced. It was something you hid. And hiding it well, that took skill. A kind of emotional sleight of hand. The difference between a ruined reputation and a flicker of hope could be as subtle as the way you passed a cup or looked away too quickly. You had to be smart, careful, precise. Maybe you saw them at the market just once a week, maybe less. You memorized the way their hand moved when they picked herbs or how they tilted their head when they listened to the baker. That was all you'd get. A few seconds of borrowed warmth in the middle of ordinary life. You never told anyone. Not your sister, not your closest friend. Because secrets like that didn't stay secret for long. Gossip was a kind of wildfire in medieval villages, and if your name ever got caught in the flames, there was no way to put it out. So you loved in glances. You built entire conversations out of half-smiles and stolen moments. You found excuses, real, useful, innocent excuses, to pass by their house or linger at the well 5 minutes longer than usual. You clutched at coincidences like they were fate. You prayed, not for a miracle but for another chance to hear their voice, even if it was just them asking for onions. Sometimes you gave a token, not because it would change anything, but because you needed it to exist. A ribbon, a scrap of cloth, a carved bead. Something small enough to be overlooked, but meaningful enough that it could be hidden under a pillow and touched when the days got too long. And if they gave you something in return, you'd treasure it like a relic. Not because it was beautiful, but because it meant something, because it proved that you weren't crazy, that they saw you too. But love like that, it was heavy. You carried it everywhere but could never show it. Couldn't speak it aloud. Couldn't ask for more. You weren't allowed to fall in love. So instead, you fell around it. Carefully, quietly, like stepping through thorns barefoot, knowing you'd bleed either way, but still hoping you could make it to the other side without being caught. Loving the wrong person back then didn't just hurt, it could ruin you. This wasn't the kind of heartbreak you walk off with a pint and a playlist. No, if you let your heart slip outside its boundaries, the cost wasn't emotional, it was existential. because the rules weren't just strict. They were sacred. Break them and you weren't just a fool in love. You were a threat to your family's future, to alliances, to entire social structures that had been built, brick by careful brick, to keep everything in its place, including you. What did wrong mean? It meant someone too poor, too far below your status, too different in faith, too inconvenient in timing. Sometimes it just meant someone your father didn't choose, or someone your older brother had plans for first. There were stories whispered from cottage to castle, of girls sent away to distant convents after being caught exchanging letters, of boys beaten, stripped of land, or disowned for daring to love beneath their class. And if you happened to be a noble and fell in love with a servant, that wasn't just frowned upon. That was treason of blood. Even if no one said it, everyone knew. Desire was dangerous. It pulled at the seams of things people worked very hard to stitch together. Marriages weren't built on love, they were transactions. Bonds between families. Political chess moves. You didn't fall in love. You were placed in love like a token on a game board. So when love came anyway, and it always did, it had to be buried deep. Because if the wrong person caught wind of it, it could be used against you. As leverage, as blackmail, as justification for shame. You could be married off in a rush just to make it stop. You could be banished. You could be made to kneel in church and confess sins that weren't sins at all, just feelings you weren't allowed to have. And yet, people still did it. They still fell. Hard. Quietly. Desperately. Because even in a world where loving wrong could destroy everything, the heart didn't ask for permission. It just beat, and hoped no one heard it too loudly. You were expected to suffer, and to suffer beautifully. It was less, "I love you," and more, "I will perish if you do not glance in my direction before winter ends." And somehow this absurd ritual was admired, expected, praised in stories, plays, and songs passed from one castle to another. It wasn't intimacy. It was symbolism. A passion wrapped in velvet, sealed with a crest, and delivered to someone who'd probably pretend not to notice. Now picture this. A knight in full armor, polished, noble, half-starved from a week-long pilgrimage, falls hopelessly in love. But not with a woman he can court. Not someone available. Not even someone single. No, he chooses a lady who's already spoken for. Married. Untouchable. Seated beside a husband twice her age and 10 times her influence. Why? Because that's how the script was written. In the world of courtly love, choosing someone unreachable wasn't a flaw. It was the requirement. You didn't seek out connection, you sought out adoration. Quiet. Devoted. Painful. The kind that made you write poetry under moonlight and sigh dramatically in public gardens. This wasn't a love meant to be fulfilled. It was meant to be felt. Endlessly. Without closure. A sort of emotional pilgrimage where the journey was the entire point. The knight, usually younger, braver, and absurdly sentimental, would pledge himself to her not in person but in principle. He might vow to serve her in thought, to carry her name into battle, to place her favor. A ribbon, a token, even just a thread from her dress, beneath his armor like a holy relic. His loyalty wasn't romantic. It was ritualistic, a noble act of long-suffering emotional theater. And she, the lady, she played her part too. She would never openly return the affection, heaven forbid. But she might glance back, smile ever so slightly, accept his sleeve or his sonnet with grace and ambiguity. Enough to feed his fantasy, not enough to confirm it. This entire ordeal was viewed not just as acceptable but as elevated. A man who loved this way was considered refined, noble, pure of heart. Never mind the fact that he was essentially tormenting himself on purpose. Physical love was frowned upon. Lust was dangerous. But emotional torment dressed in metaphor? That was culture. That was courtly. And so, across Europe, noblemen poured their longing into poems and performances that had nothing to do with real partnership. Love was no longer about building a life. It became about suffering with style. So knights bled in battle and then bled again in ballads. All for a love they were never allowed to touch. Words were risky. Actions were forbidden. So the lovers of courtly tradition found a middle ground: objects. Tiny, symbolic things passed between trembling hands or slipped into gloves and satchels when no one was looking. A knight didn't confess his feelings. He wrapped them in linen. Maybe it was a glove. Maybe a strip of fabric torn from his own sleeve after battle. Sometimes even a bloodied scrap he swore carried the scent of his devotion. More dramatic than useful, always soaked in symbolism. And these tokens? They mattered. They weren't gifts. They were messages. Wordless, coded expressions of longing. They said things a knight couldn't dare whisper in a hallway or write in plain ink. I burn for you. I fight in your name. I suffer beautifully and with style. The item itself didn't matter as much as what it stood for. It was part relic, part riddle. The lady on the receiving end had her own role to play. She couldn't respond too openly. Any affection returned too boldly could stir rumors, scandal, or worse, actual consequences. So she responded in layers. A ribbon tucked discreetly into his saddlebag. A pendant left accidentally on a windowsill. A lock of hair sewn into a sash. Sweet, sentimental, and just vague enough to protect her honor if questioned. But here's the quiet truth. Half the time, neither side knew exactly what the other meant. Was the glove a declaration of love? A plea for a favor? A poetic thank you for a poem written under moonlight about a dream she never actually appeared in? Ambiguity was part of the game. You weren't supposed to understand fully. You were supposed to feel. And so, castles became stages, courtyards became confessionals, and people carried tokens like they were carrying their own unsaid truths, carefully, tenderly, often with no idea whether they were being loved in return, or simply admired from a polite distance. It was a love of symbols, not substance, a performance of emotion, not its fulfillment. Still, for those who gave and those who received, that little thread of connection, however mysterious, meant everything. In the age of courtly love, proximity wasn't romantic, it was dangerous. Love had to keep its distance to survive. You didn't hold hands. You didn't steal kisses. You didn't sneak off behind garden walls, no matter what the poets made it sound like. The entire structure of this noble affection was built on the idea of not having, of not touching, of staying just far enough away to keep the fantasy alive, and just close enough to keep the suffering fresh. A knight might spend years worshipping a lady whose fingers he'd never once brush. He could go to war with her name stitched into his sleeve. Write verses so desperate they made angels weep. But to speak too plainly, or to get too near, that would shatter everything. Because once love became real, once it left the pedestal and stepped into the mud of human closeness, it stopped being holy. It became ordinary. And in this world, ordinary wasn't beautiful. It was dangerous. So desire had to stay clean, distant, untouched. He might see her only at feasts, flanked by nobles, eyes never quite meeting his. Or in the chapel, head bowed, hands folded like nothing in her life was aflame. Or on the balcony, watching storms roll in while he imagined 1,000 things she'd never say. That distance, that ache. It was the heart of courtly love. You didn't chase the person. You chased the ache they created inside you. And so castles echoed with love stories that never happened, filled with people who adored each other only in theory. Because reality was too crude, too sharp, too fast. They loved from afar because closeness was final. And no one really wanted final. They wanted the idea of something perfect, just out of reach. Far enough to dream about, close enough to hurt, never close enough to ruin. One of the strangest things about love in noble circles wasn't just the distance or the suffering. It was the guessing, the not knowing, the way entire relationships unfolded in half-smiles and ambiguous gifts, like puzzles no one dared solve completely. And perhaps more oddly, no one wanted to. Because if there was one rule in the game of courtly love, it was this: never be too clear. Clarity was vulgar. Certainty was low-born. Real love, proper love, aristocratic love was supposed to float above logic. It had to be poetic, not practical. So when a lady received a glove, or a laced ribbon, or a hand-stitched square of fabric that smelled suspiciously like horses and lavender, she wouldn't say, Ah, he loves me. No. She'd tilt her head, study it like a riddle carved into stone, and then pretend not to understand. Even if she did. Sometimes especially if she did. Because acknowledging love was dangerous. But pretending not to see it? That was power. She might wear the ribbon the next day. Or she might toss it aside with a chuckle that said everything and nothing. And he, oh, the poor knight, would agonize over what that gesture meant for weeks. Did she accept his devotion? Was it too bold? Did she give that look to everyone? Or just him? No one ever said what they meant. That was the game. That was the spell. And when words were exchanged, they were wrapped in layers of metaphor. A simple sentence like, "The hawk flies strangely this season," could mean 10 different things. "I miss you. I saw you at the gate. Meet me in the orchard." Or, "My husband is watching. Say no more." This kind of love wasn't about connection, it was about performance. Two people acting out the roles expected of them, each fully aware of the audience, both playing parts they couldn't break without destroying everything. And still, underneath all the layered glances and symbolic gifts, there was something real, something burning, something neither of them could name out loud. Because if they did, if they stripped away the mystery and spoke plainly, they'd leave the stage. They'd leave the dream. And dreams, in that world, were often safer than the truth. So she kept pretending she didn't know. And he kept pretending he believed her. And that was love. At least, the kind the castle walls allowed. In the medieval world, there was no such thing as just the two of us. No late-night walks without a shadow trailing behind. No secret meetings without the echo of footsteps just a little too close. Love, especially between the young, the unmarried, or the mismatched, was never a private matter. It was a public risk. And so, romance existed under surveillance. Constant, calculated, suffocating surveillance. Whether you were a baron's daughter or the miller's son, someone was always nearby to watch. Not out of curiosity. Not even jealousy. But duty. The job of protecting virtue was taken as seriously as protecting land or coin. Chaperones weren't gentle observers, they were guards in silk and wool. Mothers, aunts, family retainers, even nuns, stationed not just to supervise but to intercept. Their eyes weren't just cautious, they were trained. They knew how to read proximity, how to sense tension in a room, how to sniff out affection before a word had even been spoken. You could be standing 3 feet apart and still feel like there was a wall between you, built not of stone but of scrutiny. Even the places that might have offered a moment of closeness, the herb garden, the chapel steps, the path to the well, were patrolled. Or worse, filled with coincidental visitors, a cousin suddenly needing water, a priest on his way to prayers, a servant lost with a basket of turnips. They were never lost. They were placed, positioned, ready to catch an impropriety before it bloomed into something real. And for girls especially, the weight of being watched was doubled. Her honor wasn't just her own, it was the entire family's future. A glance out of place could stain her name. A smile too warm could threaten a marriage negotiation. So she learned early how to move like she wasn't feeling anything. To speak like her mind was elsewhere. To want with every fiber of her being without showing a trace of it. Privacy was a luxury no one had. And love under this pressure had to become invisible, or die. Because when the world is watching, you don't pass a message. You pass a secret. You couldn't just walk up to someone and tell them how you felt. That kind of courage didn't belong in the Middle Ages, especially not when half the town was waiting for someone to make a mistake. Feelings had to be hidden. Words had to be disguised. And if you wanted to send a message to the one person who made you forget how dangerous it all was, you needed help. Not just anyone. A person who could slip through spaces you couldn't. Someone who wouldn't ask questions, or better yet, someone who didn't fully understand the weight of what they were carrying. Servants were a common choice. They moved between households all the time. A folded piece of parchment could be tucked into a basket of herbs or hidden beneath clean linens. A glance. A nod. That's all it took. Sometimes a younger sibling was chosen, a child too innocent to grasp the consequences. Too curious to question the errand. You'd hand them a note for Lady Eleanor and pray they didn't stop along the way to show it to their friends. And then there were the monks. They traveled freely, respected by nearly everyone. A monk could cross city gates without a second glance. They carried books, prayers, confessions, why not a love letter stitched between the pages of a psalm? If anyone asked, they'd simply smile and say it was scripture. Even the act of writing the message took care. You couldn't say what you meant outright. "I miss you" became "the winds are colder this week." I long to see your face turned into the moon feels farther away. Every word wrapped itself in metaphor because to speak plainly was to invite disaster. Some wrote on fabric instead of paper, on the inside hem of a scarf, on the back of a woven ribbon. If ink was too dangerous, thread would speak for you. Sometimes the letter never arrived. It was lost, burned, intercepted. Other times it reached the hands it was meant for, but at the wrong moment read too late, misunderstood. But when it worked, when the message landed and they understood, you lived for that breathless moment. The knowledge that they knew, that across the distance and the rules and the silence, your heart had found its way to them. In that world, a letter wasn't just a message. It was defiance. It was longing. It was proof that even under watchful eyes, love still moved. Quietly, carefully, like fire inside glass. When love couldn't walk on its own legs, it borrowed someone else's. Not everyone had the luxury of a loyal servant or a monk with a flexible conscience. So lovers got creative. They turned to whoever was available, whoever moved through the world unseen. The kind of people no one paid much attention to until they started carrying something that wasn't theirs. Children were used more often than you'd think. Small enough to slip through back gates. Innocent enough to be dismissed if caught. A child delivering a pie might also be delivering a promise hidden in a napkin, tied with string, or folded so carefully it looked like a prayer. They didn't need to know what they carried. In fact, it was safer if they didn't. Musicians were another favorite. Especially minstrels, those drifters with lutes, loose tongues, and a knack for slipping between crowds. They could walk into a feast, play a tune, flirt with the noblewomen, and leave behind more than just a melody. A verse, a stanza, a coded line buried in a love song, that was their weapon. They could sing a confession aloud in front of dozens and no one would suspect a thing. And then, of course, there were market vendors. Bakers. Florists. The people who passed hands and baskets and bundles all day long. A wrapped meat pie might contain more than food. A bouquet might carry a ribbon that wasn't part of the arrangement. A loaf of bread might be hollowed, still warm, cradling a slip of parchment inside. Each of these people became a part of the secret. Some knew. Some didn't. But every one of them held a piece of someone else's story, if only for a moment. The risk was shared whether they agreed to it or not. Because if a message was discovered, punishment didn't just fall on the sender. It trickled down. The child. The minstrel. The baker. Anyone who touched the flame could get burned. Still, people kept doing it. They kept trusting strangers with the most delicate parts of their hearts. Because there was no other way. Love had to move, even if it had to crawl through alleyways and kitchen doors to get where it was going. And sometimes it arrived. Not in grand gestures or loud declarations, but in a crust of bread. A tune hummed too slowly. A basket tied just a little too tightly. That was enough. Because in that world, enough was everything. Sometimes the only way to say, I love you, was to let the whole village hear it and hope no one understood. When written words became too risky, lovers turned to sound. Not the whispered kind behind closed doors, but the kind wrapped in rhyme, writing on music, echoing down stone alleys and across open fields. They turned their feelings into poetry, then passed that poetry to someone who could carry it without raising suspicion, a bard, a singer, a street performer. Minstrels, those wandering souls with dusty boots and well-worn instruments, were more than entertainers. They were messengers in plain sight. They understood that every line could carry two meanings, one for the crowd and one for the person standing silently beneath a balcony, eyes lowered, ears wide open. A love poem disguised as a ballad. A public performance cloaking a private ache. It worked because people were used to poetry. They welcomed music in marketplaces and town squares. They expected songs about lost kings, old gods, and brave knights. No one blinked when a bard began singing of a woman whose hands never touched the earth or of a man whose heart burned behind borrowed armor. It was just another story. Unless it wasn't. Unless you were the woman being compared to moonlight. Or the man whose name had been twisted into a clever rhyme no one else would catch. Then every word cut sharper, deeper. It was a dangerous thrill. Because the person it was meant for would know. Maybe only them. Maybe them and one other. But they'd hear it. And they'd understand. There was no safer place to hide the truth than in plain sight. That was the genius of it. But there was also risk. If a metaphor wandered too close to the physical, if a line hinted too clearly at forbidden desire, there could be consequences. The church didn't like poetry that touched the flesh too closely. The wrong line sung in the wrong place could turn a harmless tune into an accusation. And yet, lovers kept writing, kept composing, kept humming verses no one dared recite twice. Because sometimes that was the only way to be heard. So towns filled with songs that meant nothing to most and everything to a few. Verses that slip through crowds like shadows. Rhymes built not to be famous, but to reach just one person standing silent at the edge of the audience, pretending not to listen. That was love's voice in the Middle Ages, not shouted, not written, but sung, and never repeated. When words were too dangerous and glances too obvious, people spoke with flavor. In a world where feelings had to hide beneath layers of fabric, formality, and fear, sometimes the heart had no choice but to speak through food. Not feasts or banquets, but small, humble offerings, simple things passed hand to hand, carrying meaning too risky to say aloud. A honey cake wasn't just sweet. It was a signal. A meat pie didn't just fill the stomach. It asked a question. And a piece of fruit, perfectly ripe, handed over without a word, might just say, I see you. I remember. I still care. Because food was one of the few things people could still exchange in public without raising suspicion. Everyone ate. Everyone offered gifts to neighbors. Everyone shared, especially in times of celebration or harvest. And that made it the perfect disguise. But the meaning wasn't in the food itself. It was in how it was given. When? To whom? Whether the gift was warm or cold, whole or sliced, shared openly or slipped discreetly into a basket. Sometimes a lover might pass a honey cake across a crowded table, eyes lowered, voice calm, knowing the sweetness would be tasted in private, long after the moment had passed. Other times, the gesture was more intimate. A piece of bread left on a doorstep. A pie wrapped in cloth stitched with a secret mark, one only the recipient would recognize. And the reply? That came, too, though not always in words. If the food was returned untouched, the message was clear, stop. If it was accepted and later replaced with something else, perhaps a jar of jam, or a sprig of herbs, that meant, I heard you. I feel the same. But sometimes the food was handed to someone else. To a servant. A sibling. A dog. And that hurt worse than silence. Because in that rejection, wrapped in the most innocent gesture, was a truth impossible to ignore. You are not allowed to love me. And I am not allowed to love you back. Still, food remained one of love's quietest, oldest languages. It lingered where letters couldn't go. It passed through kitchens, gardens, and doorways with stories folded inside. And for those who knew how to listen, a simple meal could taste like longing. Or goodbye. Because when every word is dangerous and every glance is a gamble, sometimes all you have left is a slice of something warm, made by hand, carried with care, and never explained. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about the ledger. To say, I do, in the Middle Ages was less about feeling and more about financing. In the stories we tell ourselves now, marriage begins with love, with connection, with two people choosing each other because their hearts align. But in the medieval world, marriage was never about hearts. It was about land, lineage, and legal obligation. You didn't marry the person who made you laugh. You married the one who brought cattle, or vineyards, or a name strong enough to protect your children for the next 3 generations. Marriage was, quite literally, a transaction. A contract signed not with affection, but with calculations. Negotiated by fathers, priests, and in some cases, entire villages. The bride and groom? They were part of the deal, like the field that came with the mill or the chest of silver that came with the bride. Their opinions mattered, but only slightly. Their feelings? Even less. What mattered was the value being exchanged. The merging of property. The strengthening of alliances. And the guarantee that nothing unpredictable like love would get in the way. A marriage wasn't built on romance. It was built on utility. On what could be gained. On what could be protected. On what could be owned. And once agreed upon, the union wasn't just a private vow. It was law, sacrament, politics, sealed with a kiss no one was truly allowed to question. Because in that world, a wedding wasn't the beginning of a love story. It was the final line of a negotiation. To understand medieval marriage, you have to stop thinking in emotions and start thinking in inventories. Because whether you were a baron's daughter or a farmer's niece, your future wasn't shaped by who you adored. It was shaped by what you were worth. And that worth? It was calculated line by line, asset by asset. For the bride's family, it started with the dowry. This was not just a symbolic gift. It was a serious transfer of wealth. Land, silver, livestock, furniture, sometimes even servants. Everything that would help establish the new household and, just as importantly, ensure the groom's family saw the bride as a profitable investment. The dowry was a message. Here is what she brings. Here is why she's valuable. Here is why this alliance makes sense. But in many places and among certain cultures, the math went the other way. The groom paid a bride price. That wasn't romantic either, it was transactional. He wasn't buying her, but he was compensating her family for the loss of her labor, her ability to bear children, her contribution to the household economy. A horse, 3 pigs, a cloak, maybe a few gold coins. Enough to show seriousness. Enough to declare intent. This wasn't about greed. It was about survival. Every union was a reshuffling of resources, a careful balancing act of what one side gave and what the other stood to gain. A wealthy woman might enter a marriage with trunks of embroidered linens and a small estate in her name. A poorer one might come with a single cow and a good reputation. But either way, her value had to be proven. And once the terms were agreed upon, that was it. There was no trial period. No reconsideration. No backing out because someone had second thoughts. Marriage was a contract, binding, sacred, and final. And if love bloomed after, that was a bonus. A blessing, maybe, but never the foundation. Because in the world they lived in, affection couldn't secure a winter's harvest. A kiss couldn't hold off debt. And passion, no matter how fierce, couldn't repair a roof or pass on a name. So they dealt in coins, in property, in livestock, and called it commitment. In medieval society, no marriage was made in a vacuum. Every union was a move on a larger chessboard, part of a lifelong game where power, inheritance, and stability mattered far more than desire. Parents didn't just hope their children would marry well. They planned for it. Years in advance. Conversations were had in corners of taverns, in cloisters behind stone walls, in letters carried over long distances by writers who never once asked what their messages contained. And those conversations didn't begin with, "Do they love each other?" They began with, "What do they own?" A marriage might merge 2 struggling farms into one that could finally produce enough grain to feed both families. It could bring together distant cousins of minor nobility to keep an estate intact. It might pull a lower-born merchant up the ladder of respectability, or rescue a noble name that had lost its fortune but not its pride. Love wasn't forbidden, but it wasn't required. And often it was inconvenient, because love was unpredictable. Love didn't care about bloodlines or boundaries. It showed up at the wrong time with the wrong person, in ways that made careful arrangements fall apart like soaked parchment. And that made it dangerous. So instead, the goal was harmony of land, of politics, of lineage. You married who fit, not who thrilled you. And that fit was judged by ledgers, alliances, family expectations, and the whims of the church. The church, after all, had its own stake in these unions. Marriage was sacred, yes, but it was also a way to preserve order. A poorly matched couple might create scandal. A cross-class marriage might ignite unrest. A union outside the faith might risk eternal damnation, or worse, political embarrassment. So the priest blessed what the parents arranged. The families watched. The guests smiled. And the couple, more often than not, stood side by side as strangers. 2 people not yet in love. Perhaps never to be. But they were legally bound, publicly affirmed, and expected to build a life together or not. Because love was a feeling. But marriage? Marriage was a system. In a world where marriages were carefully measured, weighed, and approved like trade agreements, love, real love, was a disruption. A liability. A wild card no one wanted to deal with. Because love didn't care about bloodlines. Love didn't respect dowries or inheritance laws. It didn't ask for permission. It just appeared, suddenly, inconveniently, and often between 2 people who had no business being seen together. And when it did, it terrified everyone. A nobleman's daughter falling for a common soldier wasn't romantic. It was rebellion. A merchant's son running off with a farm girl didn't inspire ballads. It threatened everything his family had built. These weren't sweet stories. They were potential scandals. Explosions waiting to happen. Why? Because love made people unpredictable. And unpredictability was dangerous in a world held together by order. A marriage arranged by 2 families secured peace, trade, protection. It told neighboring estates, "We are allies now." But a marriage chosen by the heart? That was a question mark. Could offend the wrong relative, jeopardize an alliance, start a feud. In some cases, it even started wars. Kings weren't exempt. Nobles weren't exempt. A royal choosing the wrong partner could set an entire kingdom on edge. Because love, when it refused to follow the script, didn't just break hearts. It broke systems. So whispers followed those who defied the rules. She disgraced the family. He threw away his future. They've cursed the bloodline. And yet, despite the risk, people kept doing it. Because love was stubborn. Because it asked nothing and demanded everything. Because even in a world built to suppress it, love still slipped through. And every time it did, it left behind a story, a scandal, a legend, or a warning. But never silence. Never indifference. In the modern world, we hear the word elopement and think of whispered vows on a beach or a courthouse wedding wrapped in spontaneity and joy. But in the Middle Ages, running off to marry someone without permission wasn't charming. It was dangerous, scandalous, sometimes even criminal. Because marriage wasn't just about the couple. It was about two families, two legacies, and often two territories trying to hold themselves together. When someone eloped, it wasn't just a romantic impulse. It was an act of rebellion, a public rejection of the rules that bound everyone else in place. Imagine a noblewoman fleeing with a stable hand. That wasn't just bad manners. That was a direct threat to her family's alliances. It told the world, we reject the path you chose for us. We choose each other instead. And the consequences came quickly. Sometimes the family disowned them. Sometimes the bride's father sent men to bring her back, by force. The church might refuse to recognize the marriage. The community might shun them. In certain cases, property was seized, titles revoked, names erased. If you were wealthy, eloping was political suicide. If you were poor, it might mean banishment or punishment. But either way, it meant cutting yourself off from the roots that raised you. And yet, people did it. Because in a life where every decision was made for you, who to marry, what to wear, how to pray, how to smile, choosing your own partner felt like the last piece of freedom worth fighting for, even if it cost you everything. Some couples fled to far villages where no one knew their names. Others crossed borders, started over, took new identities. They lived on the run or lived in hiding, but they lived together. And for some, that was enough. Because eloping, in its purest form, wasn't about defying parents. It was about declaring that love, real love, was worth more than approval, even in a world built to punish it. Inside monasteries and convents, life was meant to be silent, orderly, untouched by the outside world. Walls were thick, rules strict, and desire, at least in theory, was left behind with the world of flesh and temptation. But even in the most sacred places, the human heart didn't always obey. Because vows can quiet the body, but they don't always quiet the longing. Monks and nuns weren't statues. They weren't saints, at least not yet. They were people, flesh and spirit wrestling beneath wool robes and candlelight. They prayed, fasted, confessed. But sometimes, beneath those layers of devotion, something else stirred. A glance held too long during morning prayers. A shared laugh over a spilled basket of apples. A quiet conversation in the garden, just a bit too far from the others. It didn't take much. It never did. In a place where touch was forbidden and even eye contact felt electric, small moments held immense weight. A piece of bread passed during mealtime. A hand that lingered a second longer than necessary while helping with the laundry. A whispered joke between chores. These were not meaningless. They were careful acts of emotional rebellion. Tiny risks taken under the watchful gaze of God and man. And once that spark caught fire, the consequences were sharp. Because love inside sacred walls wasn't just frowned upon. It was heresy. A betrayal of vows. A disruption of the divine order. And for those who were caught, punishment came swiftly. Confession. Isolation. Sometimes banishment. In extreme cases, imprisonment or worse. Still, hearts strayed. Quietly, carefully, and always at great cost. Inside the cold stone walls of the monastery and the convent, the world was supposed to stop. Desire, ambition, longing, those were things people left behind when they put on the robe. Life became a rhythm of prayer, fasting, work, and silence. There was no flirting in the cloister, no stolen moments under moonlight, no letters passed in secret. Not in theory, but in practice, the heart never followed the rulebook. Men and women took vows of chastity, obedience, and poverty, but they didn't stop being human. They still remembered what it felt like to be seen, to be smiled at, to be noticed, and sometimes even in the holiest places that spark slipped through. Quiet, uninvited, irresistible. Maybe it began during morning chores, when their paths crossed at the well. Maybe it was a voice, soft, low, unbothered by the echoes of the chapel, that stayed in the other's thoughts long after prayers had ended. Maybe it was nothing more than the way one of them laughed while hanging laundry under a gray sky. It didn't take much. In an environment where touch was forbidden and speaking outside protocol could draw punishment, the smallest acts became electric. A shared candle, a book passed hand to hand. Even being assigned to the same work duty could feel like fate disguised as routine. And the feelings that followed? They weren't light. They were heavy, weighted with guilt, with fear, with the full knowledge that what they felt had no place in the world they'd vowed to live in. That to name it, even silently, was to court disaster. But the heart is stubborn. And so, they loved, quietly, carefully, without ever saying the word. A monk might find himself staying a few seconds longer near the convent garden, just in case she walked past. A nun might fold her robe a little slower, listening for the sound of his steps. They might not speak for weeks. They might not look at each other at all. But something lived in the silence between them, something neither God nor rule could fully erase. And yet they knew it couldn't last, that it wasn't meant to last. Because this love, if you could call it that, wasn't allowed to breathe. It existed in the in-between, in the shadows, in the pauses of a song meant for someone else. It was a quiet rebellion, not just against vows, but against a world that insisted devotion and desire could never live in the same soul. Still, it happened. Not often, but often enough that the records whisper about it. The confessions, the expulsions, the punishments that came when hearts wandered where doctrine said they shouldn't. And every time it was treated as failure, a fall, a sin. But for those who felt it, who risked it, it didn't always feel like sin. It felt like being alive, like remembering, for a fleeting moment, that behind the robe, behind the name, behind the title of monk or nun, there was still a person. And that person once had a heart that dared to notice another. In the quiet, rule-bound lives of monks and nuns, everything was watched. Every movement, every word, every silence. And so, when love found its way in unexpected, unwanted, undeniable, it had to learn how to survive beneath layers of discipline. And it did. Not through grand gestures or whispered poetry, but through small things, mundane things, things that didn't seem dangerous on the surface. Like bread. A simple loaf, handed from one set of hands to another, meant nothing to the world around them. It was food, sustenance, part of the daily rhythm of the cloister. But to two hearts that had learned how to hide, it was something else entirely. It was a question, a message, a secret. Sometimes, it was the heel of the loaf, cut thick, still warm, handed off without a word. Sometimes it was the way it was placed, carefully wrapped, folded in a cloth that wasn't standard issue. A slightly different weave, a hidden stitch, a tiny symbol sewn in along the edge that only the other would recognize. That loaf might have been saved from breakfast, or perhaps baked in secret by a kitchen monk who didn't ask questions. Either way, it meant, I thought of you, I found a way, and the response? Maybe nothing. A nod, a longer than usual glance across the cloister, or another loaf, returned later with a sprig of rosemary tucked inside, or a dried fig pressed into the crust. The kind of offering that could be explained away if anyone asked, but never needed explaining between the two of them. Because they knew what it meant to wait in silence, to care in fragments, to fall in love and never say so. In a world where affection was forbidden and attention was a sin, the smallest act of care became everything. A piece of bread became a promise, a sign that they still remembered each other, even if they couldn't touch, couldn't speak, couldn't be seen. And if the loaf went untouched, if it was returned or given to someone else. That was a message, too. A gentle no, a necessary distance, a reminder that the rules still stood, and the walls were still too high to climb. But for as long as the loaf was accepted, the connection remained. Small, sacred, unspoken. In that bread was hunger, but not for food. It was the hunger of the soul, the longing for something they could never fully have. And still, they offered it, because it was all they could give. And sometimes it was just enough. Inside monastery walls, letters were rare. Words were sacred. Every phrase carried weight. Every page required purpose. You couldn't pass a note for pleasure. You couldn't write down a feeling and expect it to be forgiven. But still, they wrote. Because when two souls ached for each other in silence, language became the only escape. They didn't call them love letters. That would have been madness. They were framed as reflections, theological musings, meditations on sacrifice or sin. The ink was black, the tone reverent, the references precise. To anyone else, these writings looked like devotional work. Harmless, holy. But between the lines, a different kind of longing breathed. A monk might write of suffering and endurance, but the suffering was his aching to see her face in the garden again. A nun might compose verses on divine beauty, but the curves she described weren't from any stained glass window. The metaphors were layered, carefully chosen, dense enough to survive scrutiny, light enough for one person, only one, to understand what they truly meant. Sometimes the letters were slipped between the pages of hymnals, tucked inside prayer books left near chapel doors, folded into clean linens or placed among herbs in the infirmary. They changed hands without ever being seen exchanged. And the language, oh, the language. I pray for the return of light in the coldest season. Might mean, I miss your voice. May the Lord bless the one who tends the garden unseen. Whispered, I noticed your hand brushing mine. The silence has grown louder than the psalms, could only mean, I'm losing myself without your nearness. This wasn't just poetry, it was survival. A lifeline disguised in doctrine. Because the moment it stopped looking holy, it became dangerous. If caught, there would be no discussion, no gentle correction. There would be judgment, punishment, removal. The love wouldn't just be forbidden, it would be erased, declared false, rewritten as sin. So they wrote with care, with restraint, with a deep ache only the exiled heart understands. And those letters, folded tight and passed like ghosts through corridors and cloisters, were never signed, never claimed, because to write I love you would be too obvious. But to write, your presence makes prayer easier, that they could get away with, at least for a little while, at least until someone looked too closely, at least until the lines no longer hid the truth. Because in the end, no language is safe when the heart starts speaking plainly. To fall in love behind monastery walls wasn't a simple matter of temptation. It wasn't a moment of weakness or just a flicker of emotion gone too far. No, inside the cloister, love wasn't just forbidden. It was dangerous. Because love didn't threaten the body, it threatened the order, the structure, the sacred silence that held centuries of obedience in place. Monks and nuns weren't seen as individuals. They were roles, functions, instruments of divine will. They weren't supposed to want. That was the world's burden, not theirs. They had left desire at the gates. That was the promise. So when two of them fell for each other, it wasn't treated as a personal mistake. It was viewed as a breach in the wall, a crack in the sanctity of the entire institution. And cracks, if not filled quickly, spread. That's why the consequences were so harsh. Sometimes it was isolation, days, weeks, even months alone, no voice, no human contact. Sometimes it was transfer, one sent away to another abbey in a distant province, out of reach, out of memory. Sometimes it was public confession, standing before the entire order with your shame laid bare, like a wound that would never quite close. And sometimes it was exile, because loving another person within a sacred order was seen as choosing the world over God. Not just a betrayal of a vow, but of purpose, of faith itself. But the danger didn't stop at the spiritual. In certain monasteries, the wrong pairing could spark political fear. If a monk with noble blood was found writing to a nun from a rival family's convent, that wasn't just scandal. It was espionage. A relationship across abbey lines could unravel alliances, shame patrons, even affect church funding. The church couldn't afford chaos, so it silenced it. But what they never understood, what frightened them most, was that even within the most controlled environment, love could still bloom. It didn't need permission. It didn't need a name. It simply happened, quietly, relentlessly, sometimes with joy, sometimes with despair, always with risk. Because when you take everything from a person, freedom, family, self, you forget one thing. You can never fully strip them of the capacity to love. And sometimes, even in a stone cell surrounded by candlelight and scripture, that love still finds someone to look at, and something to lose. Most of these stories were never written down. Not officially. Not in the records kept by abbots or scribes. You won't find them in church ledgers or illuminated manuscripts. There are no footnotes that say, "Here, Brother Elias loved Sister Amelini," but no one could know. And yet, these stories exist. You can feel them. They're hidden in the margins of old prayer books, in the small, imperfect lines of ink that don't match the rest of the scribe's hand, in the psalms repeated too often, in the notes sung a little too slowly, in the way a name appears more frequently in one monk's journal than it ever should. Because the love that grew behind monastery walls didn't vanish. It simply adapted. It folded itself into holy words, stitched itself into daily rituals, buried itself in silence and rhythm and sacred music. Somewhere, a nun wrote a hymn not to God, but to the way someone looked at her during morning light. She wrote of grace, but she was describing his voice. She wrote of longing, but she was remembering his absence during Lent. And no one ever knew, or maybe they did, but chose to say nothing. The other monks, the other sisters, they might have seen, might have heard. But in a place ruled by silence, silence could also be a gift. A way to let love survive just a little longer, unspoken but understood. Because these weren't stories for the world. They weren't meant for sermons or legend. They were private truths, painful, quiet, and powerful. Stories that lived only in glances and scribbled verses, in candle smoke, in bread passed with trembling fingers, in psalms sung with too much feeling. Most of them ended the way forbidden love always does, with distance, with exile, with a door closing softly but forever. But not all were lost. Some slipped past the silence. Some survived as ghost lines in old texts. Some lingered in the way an old hymn still makes someone weep without knowing why. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Maybe love doesn't need a monument. Just a line of scripture, a name half erased, and a feeling that, centuries later, still echoes in the quiet between verses. In the grand halls of medieval nobility, love wasn't the point of marriage. It wasn't expected, it wasn't required, and in most cases it wasn't even welcome. Marriage, for those born into titles and tapestries, was a matter of legacy, a family strategy, of survival through allegiance. Two names were brought together not because of shared laughter or late-night conversation, but because one family needed land and the other needed protection, or a border needed sealing, or an alliance needed securing against a rival lord. The young bride and groom, often no older than 14 or 15, were pawns in a game far older than either of them. The decision had already been made by fathers, uncles, priests, and scribes long before the couple ever laid eyes on each other. They didn't court. They negotiated. She might bring with her acres of fertile valley or a stretch of river. He might come with military power or a seat in court. She was assessed for her purity, her beauty, her obedience. He was judged for his title, his lands, his bloodline. When the bargain was struck, the ceremony followed, and with it, the expectation that two strangers would now live and move as one. But they didn't. They shared a bed only long enough to produce heirs. Beyond that, they lived parallel lives. He had his hunts, his councils, his mistresses. She had her embroidery, her household, her reputation to maintain. If affection grew, it was an accident. If indifference settled in, no one blinked. And beneath the surface, something colder always lurked. The understanding that this union was not about them. It was about everyone else. The pressure to maintain honor. The obligation to bear children. The unspoken rule that even if your heart withered, your duty could not. So they smiled when seen, spoke when spoken to, and carried the weight of a union that wasn't theirs by choice, but theirs to endure. Because when marriage was arranged by parchment and politics, love had no seat at the table. Only duty did, and duty never asked how you felt. After the vows were spoken and the feast had ended, reality settled into the stone walls of the manor or castle like a cold draft. The bride was escorted to her new home, often still a teenager, dressed in fine fabrics but carrying the weight of expectations older than she was. The husband, barely more than a boy himself, or sometimes already a hardened man with gray at his temples, would show her chamber and then his, and from that moment forward, they would orbit one another, but rarely collide. They weren't partners. They were co-owners of an agreement. Noble couples often had their own wings, their own routines, their own rhythms. He might spend his mornings hunting, his afternoons at council, and his evenings in a different woman's bed. She might oversee the kitchens, the linen rooms, the education of the children, some of whom weren't even hers. They might dine together for appearances, sit side by side during mass, host banquets with matching smiles. But when the guests left, so did the illusion of intimacy. They didn't argue, not usually. That would suggest passion. What they had was colder, detachment wrapped in civility. When heirs were needed, they met briefly and wordlessly, fulfilling a duty neither had asked for. There was no seduction, no soft laughter in candlelight, no lingering touch. It was mechanical, expected, a transaction folded into tradition. And when the children came, especially if a male heir was born, the physical closeness often ended entirely. The idea of divorce was unthinkable. It wasn't just frowned upon, it was socially and spiritually impossible. A nobleman might seek annulment in rare, extreme cases, but for the most part, the marriage was forever. Whether it worked or not didn't matter. What mattered was that it looked like it did. So they lived this way, for years, sometimes for lifetimes. Two people bound by obligation, not affection. Bound by names, by borders, by expectations etched into family trees and royal decrees. They could be polite, even kind. But warmth was rare. Intimacy, rarer still. They slept under different roofs within the same estate, dreaming different dreams, aching different aches. And outside, the world looked on and saw a noble couple, respectable and proper. Inside, they were two strangers playing their roles, perfectly rehearsed, quietly exhausted. And yet, neither of them ever left. Because in that world, the absence of love wasn't failure. It was tradition, and tradition didn't bend for hearts. It only demanded silence. In a world where a woman's voice mattered less than her dowry, pain found quieter ways to speak. A noblewoman, trapped in a marriage arranged before she understood what marriage even meant, had no stage to name her grief. There was no room for confession, no friends to weep beside, no diary to hide under a pillow. Her sorrow had to wear disguises. It had to pass undetected through halls lined with servants and statues of saints. And so she did what women of her station were expected to do. She embroidered. But not flowers, not saints, not birds, not always. Some stitched thorns, some stitched wolves, some stitched motifs so tangled and dark that any woman who looked closely enough could see the truth. This wasn't just needlework. It was protest in silk thread. Every hour spent bent over a hoop was time stolen from her silence. Time where her fingers could say what her mouth never dared. I am lonely. I am unloved. I am forgotten. Others turned to music. Hymns were safe, sacred, expected. But if you listened closely, you could hear the ache hiding between the verses. The high, piercing notes that trembled just slightly. The way a voice cracked during lines about sacrifice or endurance. The way she lingered too long on the word mercy. These weren't performances. They were cries. And then there were the poems. Not published, not shared, often burned. But for a while they lived. On scraps of parchment. in the corners of prayer books, scribbled in the margins of sermons. Bitter, beautiful lines laced with metaphor. A woman writing about a garden gone dry, or a songbird that forgot how to sing. Anyone reading would think it's spiritual. But she knew. It wasn't about God. It was about the man who shared her home but not her life. Because when you aren't allowed to mourn the absence of love out loud, you find other ways. You sew, you sing, you write, and every stitch, every note, every line becomes a thread in the long, invisible tapestry of noble women who lived their whole lives beside men who never truly saw them. And still, the world called them fortunate. Because from the outside, sorrow in velvet still looks like privilege. Only the fabric knows it was soaked in silence. For most people today, the end of a marriage means the possibility of a fresh start, a second chance, maybe even love. But in the medieval world, when a noble marriage ended, usually by death, never by divorce, it didn't free the surviving spouse. It opened a maze of legal traps, family politics, and relentless negotiation, especially for women. A widow didn't suddenly become her own person. She became a contested asset. Her dowry, what she brought into the marriage, might now be demanded back by her late husband's family. Her jewelry, land, and even clothing could be disputed. Her children, if any, were often claimed by the husband's relatives to preserve lineage control. And the home she lived in, that might not be hers anymore either. If she wanted to remarry, it wasn't a matter of saying yes to someone new. First, she needed approval from her own family, from her former in-laws, and from the church. Every remarriage had to be strategic, politically acceptable, financially justifiable, because marriage wasn't personal. It was a transaction. And the second transaction was always more complicated than the first. She had to fight for her own assets, sometimes against her late husband's brother, sometimes against her own sons. If she was of high rank, her remarriage could impact entire territories. Kings and lords would weigh in, even negotiate terms on her behalf. Her heart might have no say at all. And yet, remarriage was expected. Most noble women married again. Not because they were ready, not because they loved, but because remaining unmarried was dangerous. It left them vulnerable to lawsuits, to exile, to poverty. A woman alone was a threat. A woman remarried, however unhappily, was once again manageable. For noblemen, things were easier but not effortless. A widower could choose again, often more freely, but he still had to consider inheritance rights, dowry disputes, and the politics of his previous union. Marrying too soon was seen as callous. Waiting too long could disrupt family alliances. So even the second time around, marriage was never a matter of who feels right. It was always, who fits the plan now? And love, if it ever showed up, had to squeeze itself into the margins of contracts, between signatures and sealed rings. Because in this world, marriage didn't end with a funeral. It simply paused for negotiations, and then started all over again. To the outside world, widowhood might have seemed like a kind of release. The husband, perhaps distant, perhaps cruel, perhaps simply uninterested, was gone. The estate fell quiet. The pressures of managing appearances in front of a man she barely knew eased, if only slightly. But for a noblewoman in the Middle Ages, the end of a marriage didn't mean freedom. It meant waiting, watching, calculating, and often surrendering all over again. The mourning period wasn't just tradition. It was law, custom, and performance, all braided together. A widow was expected to wear black or muted gray for months, sometimes years. She was to withdraw from festivals, decline invitations, speak softly, move slowly. There were rules for how she folded her hands, rules for how she walked through town, even rules for how often she could be seen in public. Because grief, for women of noble blood, wasn't private. It was policed. Too little mourning, and she was accused of coldness. Too much, and she was suspected of scheming, perhaps even guilt. And as she mourned, quietly and carefully, she also waited. Waited to learn what part of her husband's estate she was allowed to keep. Waited to see if his family would contest her dowry or her children's inheritance. Waited to hear from her own kin. Would they offer her a place to return to, or had she become too much of a burden? She might live in the same house, sleep in the same bed, wear the same ring, but everything had changed. Her position was fragile now, contingent on the goodwill of others. The same in-laws who once smiled across dinner could now petition the court to remove her from the estate. And without a male heir to protect her, her voice became quieter than ever. If she wished to remarry, and many did, out of necessity, not desire, the process was long, tangled, and public. She needed approval from the church, from her family, from her late husband's family, from landholders, from anyone who had something to gain or lose in the transaction. She had to prove her virtue all over again, that she hadn't loved too quickly, that she wasn't conspiring, that her interest in a second union was respectable, modest, safe. And even after all that, she might still be denied. Sometimes she didn't remarry, not because she didn't want to, but because there was no one left who could marry her without setting off a firestorm of disputes and inheritance battles. So she faded quietly into the background of her own life. A dowager, a relic, a name whispered in the hallways by younger women hoping to avoid her fate. But even for those who remarried, the path was narrow. The second husband might be chosen not for kindness or compatibility, but for the alliances he could revive or the enemies he could placate. Her heart, once again, would not be consulted. And the most bitter part? Even her grief wasn't entirely hers. She was expected to grieve beautifully, with control, with solemnity, with just enough sorrow to honor her late husband's memory, but never so much that it suggested she had truly loved him. Real love was, after all, inconvenient in noble circles, especially in death. So she embroidered, she prayed, she walked the garden paths alone, month after month, while the world waited to see who would claim her next. Because in the end, a noblewoman never truly belonged to herself. Not in marriage, not in widowhood, not even in mourning. She belonged to the system, and the system never mourned with her. It simply waited until it could use her again. Long before anyone dared admit a secret crush or utter a confession, medieval lovers looked everywhere for permission from the universe. Love wasn't simply a matter of the heart. It was a conversation with the unknown. Every feeling needed validation from something bigger, nature, chance, or the unseen hand of destiny. A girl might lie awake at night, recalling every moment spent near the boy she liked, searching her memory for signs she'd missed. Did he stumble as he approached? Did her candle flicker or snuff out when she whispered his name into the dark? Did a dog bark or a rooster crow right after their eyes met across the square? Every detail could tip the scales between hope and despair. In daylight, families watched for omens too. Maybe a mother tied a ribbon on the gate and checked it in the morning. If it was tangled, she might say her daughter's romance would end in knots. If a bird perched on the roof before a suitor's arrival, it could mean luck or loss, depending on the bird. Even the way smoke curled from a chimney, the crackle of the hearth, or a sudden gust rattling the shutters was interpreted as approval or warning. Lovers learned to be patient and cautious. They hesitated before every step, watching the world with superstitious eyes. The start of a relationship could be delayed for weeks, even months, waiting for the right sign to appear. Some never began at all, not because the feelings weren't strong, but because the universe never gave its blessing. But it wasn't just fear that kept people watching for omens. It was comfort. In a life full of uncertainty, where war or sickness could appear without warning, people needed reasons for why love worked, or why it didn't. Omens gave answers. They provided meaning to the unpredictable, a sense of order when everything else felt wild. So, every budding romance played out beneath an invisible set of rules, written by wind, weather, and chance. Some couples flourished because the world seemed to smile on them. Others drifted apart, believing that fate itself had spoken. In medieval times, love was never just between two people. It was always, in some way, a matter for the stars, the animals, and the spirits to decide. Imagine the long wooden table set for supper, the air thick with the scent of stew and hearth smoke, laughter rising and falling with each passing cup. You reach for the bread fresh, still warm from the oven, and just as you pass it across the table, It tumbles from your hands and lands on the rushes below. Suddenly, the room quiets. An aunt's eyebrow arches, a cousin's smile fades, and someone at the far end murmurs a warning half in jest, half in fear. Bread on the floor, love out the door. In that instant, what was a harmless mistake becomes an omen. Bread was life, after all, sacred, daily, the heart of every meal. To drop it was to signal a break in the ordinary, a fracture in the pattern. For those watching, it meant more than a clumsy hand. It meant the love you hoped for, the match you dreamed about, had lost its blessing. Some believed it was a sign that the romance would never take root, or that the person you liked would turn away before the season changed. You might try to laugh it off. Someone might joke, "Quick, toss salt over your shoulder." But beneath the laughter, the worry lingered. Bread wasn't the only food that could carry a message. Spill your wine and someone might whisper of heartbreak. Fumble a piece of fruit and rumors of bad luck could take root before dessert was done. And so, every shared meal became a quiet test. The simplest things, a crust passed smoothly, a plate set down gently, were little rituals of hope. Each successful gesture was a silent prayer that love would hold. Each dropped crumb was a worry that it wouldn't, because in the medieval imagination, nothing was truly random. Even the bread, resting in your hands, had its own opinion about whether your heart would be safe. In the shadows of thatched cottages and behind the thick doors of stone manors, the real work of love was often done in secret, not with sweet words or bold gestures, but with charms and superstitions, whispered prayers and hidden spells. A mother, worried about her daughter's suitors, might gather herbs at dawn, rosemary for remembrance, lavender for devotion, vervain to ward off bad intentions. She'd tie them in a bundle and quietly bury them beneath the doorstep or windowsill. The hope that any unworthy lover would be turned away before crossing the threshold, and only those with pure hearts would find their way inside. Sometimes a jealous rival, spurned or overlooked, might resort to darker arts. In the dead of night, they'd bury a piece of bone, a wax figure with a needle through its chest, or a pouch of mysterious powder beneath the house of someone newly in love. These were not just threats. They were meant to sap a relationship of its joy, to curse the happiness before it could take root. And it wasn't just the women. Men, too, carried protective charms sewn into their doublets, wore rings etched with runes, or tucked secret amulets in their boots before courting the one they desired. Lovers exchanged lockets or knots of ribbon believed to protect against envy and ill will. If love faltered or faded, it was easy to believe it wasn't anyone's fault, but the work of an unseen hand. The wrong charm, a buried curse, a spell whispered on a stormy night. Any of these could explain why two people who should have been happy simply couldn't find their way to joy. So, behind every budding romance there were layers of unseen rituals. Bundles of herbs under doorways, dolls hidden in the walls, scraps of fabric tied with secret hopes or silent warnings. Because in a world where hearts were always at risk, people used every tool, sacred or forbidden, to try and guard the most dangerous thing of all, the chance to love and be loved in return. If you were unsure whether to trust your feelings, you didn't just ask a friend for advice. In medieval times, you consulted the world itself. The heavens above, the earth beneath, and, most important of all, a woman known by many names. Midwife, herbalist, seer, or simply the wise woman. Before two families exchanged vows, before a secret meeting behind the barn, people sought guidance from the natural world. Was Venus rising, or did Mars shadow the moon? Did thunder roll on the night of a proposal, or did dawn break clear and golden? Every shift in the sky was taken as a message. Planets, comets, and eclipses, phenomena we now see as science, were back then powerful portents of luck or doom. If you wanted a clearer sign, you went to the village wise woman. Her cottage stood at the edge of town, filled with drying herbs, animal bones, wax candles, and bundles of feathers. She would listen as you confessed your worries. She might pour a cup of water and watch how the ripples danced, or cast bones across a woven mat. Sometimes she read your palm, tracing the lines with a finger stained by years of root and dye. Sometimes, she simply looked into your eyes and listened to the ache you barely spoke aloud. Her verdict could shape your fate. A promise of happiness and blessing might send you boldly toward your beloved. A warning, "I see clouds over your union," could be enough to make even the bravest heart hesitate, or a family call off a match entirely. Not all trusted the wise woman, but most respected her. She knew the old ways, the ancient stories, the rules whispered by grandmothers and never written down. Her word, as much as any priest's, could decide whether love was pursued or abandoned, whether a wedding went forward or was mourned before it began. So, in a world without certainty, people looked to the weather, the stars, and the wisdom of those who listened closely. Because when your own heart's signals felt too wild to trust, it was easier, safer, to let the world decide if your love was meant to be. Medieval romance didn't just battle with jealous rivals or the whims of fate. It clashed head-on with the greatest power of all, the Church. For all its warnings against superstition, even the holiest officials knew how tightly belief, magic, and love clung to each other in the hearts of everyday people. A priest might thunder from the pulpit that charms and omens were the tools of the devil, that only God could bless a union, and only the Church could judge its worth. But outside the stone walls of the chapel, people still tucked amulets into their clothing and whispered old spells to win or keep a heart. They lit candles at shrines, then buried coins beneath trees. They crossed themselves before bed, then tied knots in secret, hoping to bind someone's affection or break a rival's hold. To the Church, all this was dangerous. It was a challenge to its authority, a sign that the old pagan ways hadn't vanished but lived on in the most intimate corners of daily life. Love, in this world, could make a person reckless, willing to risk not just shame or loss, but the accusation of heresy. To love without God's blessing, to cling to rituals the priests forbade, was to risk spiritual exile. Some who tried were punished, shunned, or forced to repent before the whole village. And yet, despite the risk, people clung to both faith and superstition, praying to saints with one breath and hiding love spells with the next. Because in their hearts, love was too precious to trust to a single source of hope. It needed all the help it could get, divine and earthly, sacred and secret. And in this struggle, love sometimes lost. Sometimes it was broken by fear, but sometimes, against all odds, it survived, haunted by superstition, blessed by faith, and kept alive by the stubborn wish that somewhere in the tangle of heaven and earth, the heart might find safe passage after all. Tomyris versus Cyrus. Vengeance, honor, and love lost. Before her name echoed through the halls of rival kings and terrified emperors, Tomyris was first a daughter of the grasslands, then a mother and finally a queen. She led the Misajte, a nomadic people for whom home was the endless horizon, where the wind never stopped and the rivers ran fierce. Tomyris wore no jeweled crown, but her presence was as commanding as thunder. Her rule wasn't born of inheritance or political game. It was earned, day by day, through courage, wit, and a spirit that refused to bow. The Misajte lived by simple truths: loyalty to kin, swiftness in battle, and reverence for the bonds of blood. Tomyris embodied all of these, but what set her apart was the intensity of her love, especially for her only son. He was her pride, the future of her people, a reminder of what she stood to lose every time a foreign army drew near. In the tent at dawn, she braided his hair and reminded him of his ancestors. By the fire at night, she spoke to him of justice and freedom, and the fierce duty of protecting their land. Her leadership was not the kind written about in epic poems, aloof, cold, or detached. Instead, it was personal, passionate, and profoundly human. Tomyris ruled not just as a sovereign, but as a mother, and in her heart, these two roles could never be separated. It was that bond, a mother's devotion, fierce and unyielding, that would ignite a war the world would never forget. For Tomyris, love was not a weakness. It was the spark that set empires ablaze. Cyrus the Great, Lord of Persia, wasn't a man easily denied. He conquered with armies and negotiated with words sharper than any blade. When he cast his eyes on the lands of the Misajte, he didn't charge in with brute force. He chose a different weapon: deceit. First came the envoys with flattering promises. Then, lavish gifts meant to impress or unsettle. But Tomyris was too wise for flattery, too seasoned to trust the honeyed tongue of a king who had devoured empires. The tension between them simmered, a dangerous dance along the borders of her world. But it was her son, young, proud, still learning the brutal rules of power, who was caught in Cyrus's web. Lured by a false sense of security, separated from his people, he fell into Persian hands. In captivity, Cyrus used every tactic: bribes, persuasion, threats, and finally humiliation. The news reached Tomyris like a knife to the heart. Her son, her blood, broken not on the field of battle but in the darkness of a foreign cell. Unable to bear the shame and grief, he took his own life. For Tomyris, grief was not a silent thing. It became a flame that consumed her sorrow and transformed it into fury. What Cyrus had stolen wasn't just a child. He had stolen her future, her hope, her trust in the old agreements of honor. And so, the queen who had once been content to watch the horizon and keep peace became something else entirely. A storm gathering on the steppe, a mother with nothing left to lose, and a leader ready to turn her pain into war. Tomyris did not mourn in silence. She rose from the ashes of heartbreak as a force the Persians had never faced. Her grief sharpened into resolve. Her sorrow became strategy. The death of her son was not only a family tragedy. It was a direct assault on her people's honor. She sent a message to Cyrus. A warning, clear and defiant. You have taken my blood through deceit. Now prepare to face me in the open, where only courage and fate decide. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. With her warriors at her side, Tomyris swept across the plain. Her army was not vast in number, but fierce in spirit, forged by hardship and bound by loyalty. They moved like the wind, silent, relentless, everywhere at once. Tomyris herself led from the front, visible and unyielding, her armor gleaming in the early sun, her presence a rallying cry for every soul who rode with her. When the armies finally met, it was more than a clash of weapons. It was a battle between two worlds: the sprawling empire of Cyrus, polished and powerful, and the wild freedom of Tomyris Mesajte, raw and unbroken. Steel met sinew, horse met chariot, and above it all, Tomyris hunted for Cyrus himself. The fighting was savage. Spears shattered, shields splintered. The cries of the wounded joined with the roar of the living. Tomyris fought as both queen and mother, her vengeance not cold, but blazing, fueled by a pain too deep for words. When at last Cyrus fell, it wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the reckoning Tomyris had sworn. She stood over the king who had destroyed her family, not as a conqueror hungry for land, but as a mother demanding justice. The field was stained with the memory of her loss, but also with the indelible mark of her honor. A victory not only for herself, but for every soul who ever loved, lost, and dared to fight back. When the dust of battle settled, the impossible had happened. Cyrus the Great, conqueror of Babylon, founder of empires, the man believed unconquerable, now lay silent beneath the endless steppe sky. Tomyris, a queen from lands outsiders called wild and distant, had done what no city, no army, no legend had managed before. Word spread swiftly, carried by terrified messengers and awestruck traders. In the markets of Babylon, people whispered that the stars had shifted. In the courts of Egypt, advisors debated what it meant for their own borders. Even far-off Greece took notice. Poets wondered how a nomad queen, not a king, had toppled the king of kings. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was the undoing of a myth. For years, Cyrus's name had been a warning and a prophecy. Now, his defeat by Tomyris was a story that traveled farther than any army, an echo that reached every place his banners once flew. But for Tomyris, this was never about glory. She didn't linger to boast or build a throne on Persian ruins. The victory was personal, a reckoning paid in blood for a son lost to treachery. She had restored her family's honor and sent a message that even the mightiest could fall, not by the sword of a rival king, but by the fury of a grieving mother. And as the ancient world reeled, One truth lingered. No empire, no matter how vast, was immune to the pain of those it tried to conquer. Not when love and vengeance rode together. Not when a queen like Tomyris carried both in her heart. With Cyrus gone and the Persians defeated, the world might have expected Tomyris to seize everything within her grasp. She could have marched her warriors into conquered cities, demanded tribute, raised new banners across foreign temples, and carved her name into the stones of Persia itself. The opportunity was hers, and no one would have dared challenge her right. But Tomyris was not like other conquerors. For her, vengeance was complete the moment justice was served. She looked across the battlefield, not with the greed of empire, but with the sober eyes of a mother who knew the true cost of war. Her heart was not set on ruling new lands or lording over new peoples. It was set on returning home, carrying her honor intact, and mourning her son with her people under the endless sky. She gathered her army, tended to the wounded, and honored the dead, both friend and foe. She took nothing from Persia but the knowledge that she had defended her family, her freedom, and her pride. The spoils of war meant little compared to the peace of knowing she had answered betrayal with courage and violence with restraint. And so, Tomyris led her warriors back to the steppe. She refused the crown of a foreign land, letting the memory of her victory settle quietly into legend. Her choice echoed long after the armies disbanded, reminding the world that sometimes true greatness is not found in how much you take, but in what you choose to walk away from. The world would remember her not as a conqueror, but as a mother, a queen, and the woman who faced the mightiest king and returned home free. Out where the wind erased boundaries and the sky seemed bigger than the world, nomadic women grew up learning they would never be mere shadows in a man's story. There was no palace wall to hide behind, no city court where rank and gender could shield you from hardship. Every day was survival, and survival demanded that everyone, young, old, male, or female, prove their worth. Girls were taught to ride almost as soon as they could walk, straddling shaggy ponies, gripping the reins with small, determined fists. Mothers and aunts showed them how to string a bow, how to track an antelope across the steppe, how to wield a knife when the camp was threatened. They learned to mend saddles, break wild horses, and tell the difference between the howl of wolves and the challenge of a rival clan. Each skill was more than a task, it was a statement. I am needed here. I can defend what I love. When the camp was threatened or the herd vanished into a blizzard, women rode out with the men. Some commanded bands of warriors. Others led migrations, deciding when to move and where to settle. They sat in the circle of elders, and their voices carried weight, sometimes more than their brothers or fathers. Wisdom and courage, not gender, won you a place at the fire. There were mothers who fought with blades in their hands, daughters who inherited command, widows who gathered the scattered and rebuilt families from ashes. These women stitched wounds after battle, grieved their dead, then rose before dawn to guide the living forward. Their leadership wasn't just accepted, it was expected. On the steppe, legend and daily life blurred together. The story of a girl who held the frontier alone, or a matriarch who led her people through famine, became as much a part of tradition as the names of rivers or the trails of stars overhead. For every king sung by the bards, there was a queen or warrior woman. Her deeds passed from mother to daughter, teaching each new generation that on these wild grasslands, no one would hand you power. You had to seize it for yourself. And many did, again and again, as fierce and free as the wind. Life on the steppe didn't leave room for monuments or archives. Nomadic clans had no use for carved stones or gilded scrolls. They carried their history with them, stitched into their stories and sung into the bones of the night. When evening fires flickered low, children gathered around elders and bards, their faces lit by orange glow, their eyes wide with anticipation. The stories began. Slowly, sometimes in song, sometimes in half-whispered prose. Each tale was a living thing, shaped by every voice that carried it. A bard's song might recall the great migration after a winter storm, when whole herds vanished in snow and only the bravest riders, some men, some women, brought the people to safety. Another story, spoken by a grandmother with hands worn from work, would recall an ancient feud, a forbidden romance, or a battle that changed the fate of the clan. These weren't just entertainments. They were memory made audible. The law, the lineage, the shared triumphs and shames, all encoded in narrative, repeated until even the youngest child could recite the names of ancestors, the rules of hospitality, the songs to sing when mourning or celebration called. Nothing was written. Everything was remembered. And in that way, the stories changed slightly with every telling, growing, breathing, evolving, yet always circling back to the truths that held the people together. If a leader fell, it was the bard who gave the eulogy, and the children who kept the eulogy alive for the next generation. If a new enemy threatened, the stories of old victories became both instruction and encouragement, a living blueprint for courage. On the steppe, to forget was the greatest shame. To remember out loud was to ensure your people's spirit would outlast any storm, any famine, any enemy. History here wasn't ink on paper. It was the warmth of voices, the persistence of memory, and the power of belonging to a story much older than yourself. The people of the steppe lived without marble halls or vaulted archives. Their world left little trace behind. No cities rising against the horizon, no towers etched with names, no shelves heavy with books. Instead, every lesson, law, and legend was kept in minds and hearts, woven into habits, rituals, and daily work. Decision-making didn't happen behind closed doors. Instead, it happened beneath the sky, gathered in circles on the open plain. Disputes were settled by elders who remembered not just the last conflict, but the patterns of generations. Wisdom was measured not in years spent reading, but in winters survived, journeys endured, and the stories a person could recall. Every tradition had its keeper. The grandmother who remembered which herbs to use for fever, the uncle who could recite the terms of an old alliance, the chief who recalled the migration routes that once saved the herd. Teaching was practical, personal, and always face-to-face. You learned to respect the fire by tending it, learned to honor your ancestors by repeating their deeds until they became your own. With no written code, the tribe's customs lived in the rhythm of daily life. How you greeted a guest, how you divided meat after a hunt, how you buried the dead. All of it was guided by rules spoken, never scribbled. If you broke a tradition, someone always noticed, and the story would be retold as a warning, a lesson, or a joke, echoing until it became a part of you. And so, even as seasons changed and the people moved, nothing essential was lost. Every campsite became a living classroom, every campfire a council, every journey another chance to rehearse the wisdom that had kept them alive for centuries. For the nomads, history was as light as a story, as strong as a promise, and as enduring as the wind itself. Their monuments weren't built from stone. They were built from memory, passed hand to hand, heart to heart, so nothing was ever left behind. To the nomads of the steppe, faith was not tied to stone temples or gilded altars. There were no priests in velvet robes, no incense curling around pillars, no sacred ground fenced off from the dust and wind. The world itself was the temple. The endless sky, the rolling grass, the river's path, the circle of fire at night. Worship was simple, direct, woven into the rhythms of daily survival. Prayers were whispered before setting out at dawn, or as a pot simmered over the flames, or as a storm gathered on the edge of camp. Gratitude was offered to the sky for rain, to the earth for grass, to the ancestors for guidance. When a horse fell sick or a child was born, the people sought signs in clouds and rivers, trusting that the sacred spoke through the ordinary. Belief was flexible, able to absorb whatever the world brought. If a traveler from distant lands spoke of new gods or customs, the clan might listen, curious, never fearful. They could add a new ritual to their own, adapt a prayer to a new need. Their religion was a living thing, shaped by the road, by hardship, by discovery. Sometimes, sacred objects traveled with them. A stone from an old campsite, a feather from a rare bird, a small carved figure passed from mother to daughter. These things held stories and blessings, not because of where they came from, but because of what they meant along the journey. To these people, faith was not a boundary, it was a companion. It grew, shifted, and wandered alongside them. It comforted when the world was harsh and celebrated when the harvest was good. There were no walls between the spiritual and the real, only a seamless horizon where the divine was as close as the next campfire and as vast as the steppe itself. And so, their gods traveled with them. Their rituals changed with the wind. And their hope, like their herds, was always moving forward, never lost. To most of the world, greatness was measured in monuments. The taller the tower, the grander the tomb, the longer the inscription. But for the steppe people, legacy was lighter and more enduring. It moved from voice to voice, surviving not in monuments, but in memory. There were no statues of their queens on city squares, no libraries recording the victories of their chieftains. Instead, their stories lived in the way a child recited the lineage of her clan, in the way an old warrior remembered the names of every horse lost and every friend saved. Their victories, their loves, their betrayals and recoveries were kept alive by those who dared to remember and retell. Night after night, generation after generation. Each story was both a lesson and a blessing. To recount how a matriarch led her people through famine was to teach resilience. To sing of a warrior who forgave a rival was to praise mercy. In every tale, history blurred with myth, and myth gave ordinary people a taste of the immortal. So long as a story was spoken, so long as it passed through the lips of the living, the person it named never truly died. Even as tribes scattered, were conquered, or faded into the anonymity of other cultures, their stories rode on the wind. A song sung over a grave, a proverb shared before a journey, a mother's warning before nightfall. These were the living stones of the steppe. They outlasted palaces. They survived fires, droughts, and exile. So, while their cities might vanish and their traces fade, the nomads understood something the builders of empires often forgot. A legacy built in hearts and memory endures beyond stone and steel. On the vast open grasslands, to be remembered in story was the only immortality that ever mattered. Imagine a land so vast, the distance between coasts was measured not in miles, but in months of dust, hunger, and risk. Forests thick as night, plains stretching forever, mountains cutting the sky in two. For generations, the heart of America was an untamed wilderness, a place that both invited and threatened anyone bold enough to cross it. Then came the idea: connect east to west by steel, one relentless, gleaming track at a time. The building of the railroads was an act of national imagination, a leap of faith that a country of scattered towns could become something bigger, united, ambitious, alive. The first spike was driven, and from that moment the world began to change. Workers and surveyors cut through rock and forest, laying down miles of promise with every tie and rail. With each new station, raw land became crossroads. Settlements huddled near the tracks, growing into towns. Those towns, drawn by the rhythm of arriving trains, blossomed into cities almost overnight. A whistle in the distance meant more than travel. It meant goods, news, hope, and the chance for a new beginning. Frontiers shrank. The journey that once took months by wagon could be done in days. Farmers shipped wheat to distant markets. Miners sent gold to hungry banks. Families traveled to places they'd only heard about in stories. Suddenly, the vastness that had once separated Americans now joined them, knot by knot, town by town. But more than anything, the railroad brought a new sense of possibility. The horizon, which once dared you to chase it, could now be reached. And with every train that rolled west, the wild promise of America became a little more real. The story of America's railroads is often told with iron and steam, with images of sleek locomotives racing across the plains. But if you looked closer, you'd see the real engine, thousands of laborers, their hands battered, faces burned by sun and wind, backs bent beneath impossible loads. Chinese workers blasted tunnels through granite in the Sierras, dangling from ropes above cliffs, setting fuses, and scrambling for cover before the mountains roared. Irish immigrants shoveled earth and pounded spikes, moving fast across the flatlands, laying track at a pace that startled even the railroad bosses. Black workers, freed from slavery but chained by poverty, took the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs, hoping each day's wage might build a better future for their families. They worked in blistering heat and freezing storms. They shared cramped tents, ate plain rations, sent most of their earnings back home. The work was grueling and endless, 16-hour days, 7 days a week. Yet the men who built the lines were paid little, fed less, and kept apart by language, culture, and prejudice. Their labor changed the nation, but the nation often looked away. They were segregated from white crews, excluded from celebrations, and written out of the stories that followed. When the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit, the cameras captured wealthy businessmen and company officials, the workers who made it all possible. Most were sent away before the photos were taken. Still, the legacy of these laborers endures in every mile of track, every town the railroad made possible, and every journey that stitches America together. The steel rails rest on their shoulders, and their hope, quiet, battered, unstoppable, still rides every train that crosses the continent. Building the railroads was more than just laying steel. For those on the ground, it was a gauntlet, an ordeal that asked everything from a person and too often gave little in return. Workers faced dangers every day. Explosions echoed through mountain passes as Chinese crews blasted rock, sometimes never making it out of the tunnels they carved. Irish laborers battled freezing winds, prairie fires, and the endless grind of moving earth by hand. Infections spread through crowded, unsanitary camps. Accidents were common, so were avalanches, floods, and the ever-present threat of hunger. Safety was a luxury. Pay was meager. Most days, a man's life was worth less than the tools he carried. Wages were handed out unevenly. Chinese workers earned far less than whites, and black laborers were often paid the least of all, with little hope for advancement. Housing was segregated. Supplies and treatment were divided along lines of language, skin, and birthplace. When disaster struck, and it often did, it was the most vulnerable who paid the price. The records rarely listed their names. There were no monuments for the lost. Newspapers focused on progress, rarely on sacrifice. And yet, despite the hardship and injustice, the workers kept going. Maybe for a family back home. Maybe for the promise of a future, however distant or uncertain. Their endurance, quiet, unrecognized, and often invisible, is what turned the idea of a nation-spanning railroad from fantasy into reality. But beneath every ribbon of steel, every shining locomotive, lies a story of struggle and divide. A human cost that can't be measured by timetables or profit ledgers, but is written, silently, into the land itself. The progress promised by the railroads came at a steep price, one that was paid not just in sweat and labor, but in the very bones of the land. Track by track, the iron road carved through forests, prairies, and mountains, places that had been home to countless generations before the first whistle blew. The great buffalo herds, once so vast they blackened the horizon, were slaughtered almost to extinction. Hunters rode the trains, firing rifles from open windows just for sport, leaving carcasses to rot by the thousands. What was called progress for some became devastation for the plains tribes whose lives depended on those animals. Food vanished, cultures shattered. Hunger and violence followed wherever the tracks stretched. But it wasn't just the buffalo who lost their home. Native American nations saw treaties broken and land seized as the railroad advanced. Surveyors redrew boundaries without consent, while settlers, emboldened by the promise of cheap land and a quick ride west, pushed ever deeper into ancestral territories. Villages were uprooted. Sacred grounds were crossed by the relentless march of progress. Streams were rerouted, forests cleared, and prairies plowed under. The railroad turned wilderness into farmland, city lots, and miles of barbed wire. The landscape was forever changed, scarred by the ambitions of those who believed the continent could be claimed with a map and a spike. For all its promise, the railroad left deep wounds on the land, on the people who called it home, and on the memory of a wilder America that vanished beneath the tracks. Progress came, but it came as a storm, remaking everything in its path and leaving loss that no amount of movement or invention could erase. The railroad was more than a machine or a business. It became a symbol, a myth made real, manifest destiny. This was the belief that Americans were destined, by fate, by God, by history itself, to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, to conquer, tame, and own every inch of the continent. Politicians praised the railroad as a triumph of national spirit. Newspapers cheered each new mile, calling it proof that America could do anything. It didn't matter that the land was already home to countless nations, or that wild places would vanish forever. The story people told themselves was one of destiny. The railroad, they said, would unite the country, erase the wilderness, and make every frontier safe and profitable. But this vision came with a shadow. The language of destiny made it easy to ignore the cost. It justified broken treaties, erased cultures, and excused violence against anyone who stood in the way. If someone protested, they were called an obstacle to progress. The nation, they insisted, must move forward, no matter who got left behind, and no matter what was lost along the way. As the trains rolled on, manifest destiny hardened into a national myth, a story that turned conquest into virtue, and tragedy into progress. The continent changed shape. The world moved faster. But the dream that fueled the rails was never as simple, or as innocent, as it looked from the platform. Even now, as engines speed from coast to coast, the echo of that myth lingers, reminding us that every journey forward carries the weight of what was swept aside to make it possible.